You are when this world is nothing but a memory. Where I stand beside you in eternity. In your perfect love is where I will be. And so I is who you are. Love is not just the words you say, it's who you are.
It doesn't look like you're going to, well, I guess I'm on now.
Have it in me to last through the week. Lord, fill me up, so there's no need to eat. They're fasting now, off the ground, other feet higher than what I felt prior. I am just so tired living in your dark world. Higher, devil, you are fired. See how this works? You no longer work for me. Find me in a bill full of chemicals, talking to God about how I'm happy to be here. Find me in a bill full of chemicals, talking to God about how I'm happy to be here. On to a new level, new levels, new devils, new devils, new strength, and I'll have peace in the end. So I'll go wherever he wants me to go. All he has to do is show.
Okay, we'll get started here pretty soon. We're just giving people a couple extra minutes to get here. Hopefully we get a few extra people. But it'll be on the YouTube, so that'll be fine too. Here's Pat. Here's Pat. Everybody a couple more minutes. Start at about 5 after 7. I think we're going to get started here. How many people were here last time I spoke with Science in the Bible Part 1? Just raise your hand. Oh, good. I got a bunch of repeat people. I didn't scare you away. That was very good. Last time I talked about, is there a war going on between science and the Bible? And that's the general thought amongst Christians, is that science is the enemy of the Bible. But with all the facts I gave you last time, I hope you understood that that is not true, that science is actually the friend of Christians. It's helping us to be more real to the world. It's helping us to be able to arm ourselves to tell people that God is real, and that science is actually helping us to prove that. I talked about some of the things last time called an irreducible body, a rat trap. Rat trap will not work if one little piece is missing. This is what puts the lie to evolution, because there are things that cannot be made by evolution. They have to come into existence whole cloth. One of the facts that I just found out was that water first appeared on Earth 3.5 billion years ago, and single-cell organisms appeared almost instantaneously at the same time. There was no time for them to evolve. They just appeared. It actually follows the Bible very closely. So single-cell organisms are another irreducible construct. You can't take one piece away from them or they don't exist. We also talked about the fact that science can only talk about 2% of reality. They can tell you how that 2% operates, what it does, what its properties are. They can't even tell you where that 2% came from. The other 98% of reality, which they call dark energy and dark matter, they have no idea what it is. So if someone comes to you and says, I can't believe in God because science is proving everything. Science is explaining everything. Well, you can say to them, no. Science only explains the action of 2% of reality. They don't even know where that came from. And the 98%, they have no idea what it is. The only reason that they know that the 98% even exists is because of the effect that it has on the 2%. Isn't that how we know God exists? Because of the effect he has on us? They say, you can't prove God, but they're saying that dark energy and dark matter exist because of the effect they have on the 2%. I think they're being a little hypocritical. I also talked about evolution, Darwin, and how his evolution just doesn't work by the fossil evidence. There are so many fossils that show that during the Cambrian period, there was an explosion of life. That 530 million years ago, every single form of life that's on Earth now came into existence in a very short period of time. It didn't evolve, because before that, there's no evidence of anything. And then all of a sudden, in the Cambrian period, there's fossils of every single form of life. The whole idea that Darwinism is being taught as truth in our schools really is wrong. Darwinism is a theory, but it has become a religion. People have taken it to the point where you can't criticize it one tiny little bit, or you lose your job, you get kicked out of your job in college, you lose your tenure. I found this from 1966. This is April 8th, Time cover magazine, and it says, "Is God dead?" Now in 66, they did an experiment where they found, or actually it was in the 60s, they took the primordial soup that they thought was what started on Earth, the gases and things are on Earth. They put electricity through it, and it formed amino acids. And they said, wow, we can form DNA just by doing that. Well, it turned out that they fudged the experiment. They actually loaded it so that it would make amino acids. They never were able to create any DNA, and to this day have never been able to get anything to go in and form DNA in any way, shape, or form. Okay. So even Darwin, when he wrote his book, Origin of the Species, even Darwin, in the last chapter of his book said, its several powers having been originally breathed by the Creator in a few life forms into one. Even Darwin acknowledged the power of the Creator. Today, they forget that. Neo-Darwinism has rose beyond that. They say that everything occurred by pure random chance. Everything evolved just that way. Last time I touched on the Big Bang Theory, how the Big Bang Theory actually gave a beginning to existence. How science before that thought everything in the universe and our earth existed forever. So there was plenty of time for anything to happen by pure random chance. But once they found out that there was actually a beginning, which is what our Bible has always said, once they found that there was a beginning, and it was about 14 to 15 billion years ago, there wasn't enough time for all of these things that they thought evolution would bring along to happen. And also I talked about how many fine little things were preset at the Big Bang to lead to life. There were so many preset factors that were set at the beginning that it could not possibly have happened by chance. And that's what I want to talk about today. I want to talk about that fine-tuning, that everything that was set up right at the beginning so that we could be here, so intelligent life could come here. There was intelligent design at the very beginning. Okay, let's talk right about now about the reality that we're currently living in. Okay, we live on an earth and we have night and day. That means the earth makes one full rotation in a 24-hour period. At the equator, the earth's diameter is 24,000 miles. That means at the equator, anybody standing there is traveling at 1,000 miles an hour all the time. Now, you don't have to worry too much about that because we're at the 30-degree latitude, and that's about 875 miles per hour. But it gets worse, okay? The earth is also traveling around the sun at 20 miles a second. That's 72,000 miles an hour. And then our whole solar system is traveling around the Milky Way at 10 times that speed. Now, what I want to know is, can you feel it? You can't, can you? But do you believe it? Why? Why do you believe that? Everybody's shaking their head. You believe it because you've read it in books. You know that science has done tests and found out the earth is round, the earth is spinning. We have seasons, we have day and night, so that this is happening. But you can't trust your own senses for it. You have to look at tests and look at it rigorously as science does to find these things out. That 72,000 miles an hour that we're going around the sun, that took some calculation. One of the cool things is we are in a completely circular orbit around the sun, which all the other planets in our solar system are not. If we were not in a circular orbit, we would boil at one point and freeze at another. There would be no life on Earth. Earth is really set up very strangely. So the secrets of nature are not just revealed to us by our senses. We have to look at it. We have to study it. We have to investigate it. And that's also true of the Bible. What the Bible says to us, we just can't get from just a straight literal reading. We have to spend some time with it and study it and look at what it's really saying. Now, I'm going to ask you a question. Who made all the plants and flowers and trees that are on earth? And that's the answer everybody's going to give. God. Because you remember in Genesis, but you got to read Genesis. It doesn't say God created the plants, the trees, and the weeds and the wheat. It says God let the earth produce plants, some to make grain for seeds and others to make fruit and seeds in them. But it also says God set it up. God pre-programmed earth so that those plants and seeds and that could grow. But then the earth did that. So the Bible doesn't disagree with the idea that life can come on earth by preset conditions. It actually says that. One thing I just found out about, one of the big problems they say with the Bible is that it doesn't talk about dinosaurs. In Genesis, if the Bible is giving a true account of creation, there should be something in there about dinosaurs. Well, in Genesis 1:21, in every translation you read, it says, God created the large sea animals. Unfortunately, that's a mistranslation. The Hebrew words, if you look at the words that are translated to large sea animals, actually means gigantic reptiles. So the Bible actually talks about dinosaurs. So God set the earth up. He fine-tuned it so that its basic attributes could produce life. And the Bible agrees with that. And we're going to talk about some of that fine-tuning and the things that were necessary for us to come into existence. And how that random chance, which is what most people believe, random chance just doesn't work. There was a physicist by the name of Paul Davies, famous physicist, who actually was an atheist. And he said, scientists are slowly waking up to an inconvenient truth. The universe looks suspiciously like a fix. The issue concerns the very laws of nature themselves. For 40 years, physicists and cosmologists have been quietly collecting examples of the all too convenient coincidences and special features in the underlying laws of the universe that seem to be necessary in order for life and hence for conscious beings to exist. Change any one of them, and the consequences would be lethal. Paul Davies, as I said, was not a man of faith, but a scientist, and he followed the facts where they led them. And then in 1988, everyone knows Stephen Hawking, a very famous physicist. He wrote a book that was a bestseller, but I don't think anybody ever really read it. And he said that the overall density of the universe, if it were changed by even, now listen to this, 0.0000000000001%, there would be no stars, galaxies, and there would be no life. And then also, if the rate of expansion after the Big Bang had been smaller than even 1 part in 100,000 million, the universe would have recollapsed before it even reached 1% of its current size. And then another scientist, Fred Hoyt, who taught the idea that the universe had a no beginning and then very reluctantly was proven wrong, and he was the one that coined the name Big Bang, and he actually did it as a derogatory comment about what happened. But in 1959, he was giving a lecture on how stars in their interiors created every natural occurring element in the universe, and was explaining that they do this with the simplest element, hydrogen. Stars start out just with hydrogen. If this were purely a scientific question and not one that touched life, one would think a designer had done this. Then we are back again to a monstrous sequence of accidents, and he liked that conclusion even less because he knew it would be laughably far-fetched. Every single element that forms us was formed in the heart of a star. We are stardust. Everything started with hydrogen, and it had to go through that high heat, high pressure, high gravity to be changed into whatever element it was necessary to create life. The stars would create all those elements. They would live their lifespan, then they would explode and spew all that stardust out into the galaxy. And then that stardust would be incorporated into our solar system, into our sun, into everything. And gradually, enough elements were produced to create life. 2 decades later, a guy by the name of Hoyle went even further, who was writing in the Caltech Alumni magazine. Would you not say to yourself, some super calculating intellect must have designed the properties of the carbon atom? Otherwise, the chance of my finding such an atom through blind forces of nature would be utterly minuscule. Of course you would. A common sense interpretation of the fact suggests that a super intellect had monkeyed with physics as well as with chemistry and biology, and that there are no blind forces worth speaking about in nature. The number one calculates from the facts seems to me so overwhelming as to put this conclusion beyond question. The point is that nature has no intelligence. Nature isn't capable of choosing anything. It just goes about its business. But that's not how the universe and our planet worked. There were choices made. There were things that were set up to make life happen. I talked last time about some of the physical properties that were set up at the instant of the Big Bang, and they were designed to bring life. They were designed so that it could happen. And there was a designer. There are 4 fundamental forces that were set up right at that point of the Big Bang, when that big explosion happened, when nothing came into something, which science has no idea how to explain. The 4 forces are gravity, the electromagnetic force, the weak nuclear force, the strong nuclear force. Now, the only one that you're familiar with is gravity. And we just said that we're traveling at an incredible speed through the universe. Our planet is spinning at 1,000 miles an hour. And we're still stuck here. And what's sticking us here is gravity. And gravity is the attraction of matter to matter. Now, science knows that happens. Even these pews have a gravity that is actually pulling on us. We don't feel it because it's very small. But the earth, because it's so big, has a gravity that actually holds us here and brings us down. But they don't know what it is. They just know that it exists. Now, if gravity was just a little bit weaker, all of our atmosphere would escape. It would fly off into the space. If it was stronger, our atmosphere would be so thick that we couldn't breathe it. If it changed by just a factor of 10 to the 34th power, that's 10 with 34 zeros after it. If it changed by just that small percentage point, there would be no life. Now, science has tried to figure out this matter-to-matter attraction. And by mathematical calculations, gravity should be much higher. It should actually be double what it is. But it's not. It's the perfect gravitational attraction to allow life to exist. Now, one of the theories about gravity and why there's only half the gravity that science would predict is that there's another dimension. And gravity is affecting that other dimension. I don't disagree with that. God has said his kingdom is all around us. It could be that other dimension. Now, the other forces that we talked about, electromagnetic force, is what keeps electrons in orbit around their nucleus. And for life to exist, we need those vast mix of elements that are made in the stars. And it's the electromagnetic force that helps bind those atoms together. If there was weaker, the electrons would fly off and there'd be no new elements. Stronger, and they would never leave the hydrogen to form any elements to begin with. The other 2 forces, I don't want to take the time to explain them to you, but really what really matters is the ratio between them. And they hold that nucleus of the atom together. They help in forming new elements and help them to be stable. Now, carbon. Carbon is one of the building blocks of organic life. All of us have huge amounts of carbon in our bodies. Every organic thing on earth has carbon in it. Carbon is formed in stars. But to form carbon in a star from hydrogen, it has to go through an element called beryllium. And beryllium is radioactive and has a half-life of 10 to the minus 16th seconds. It doesn't exist for very long. It just appears and disappears. But somehow, in that high-pressure, humongous heat of the center of a star, hydrogen comes in contact with some helium and forms that beryllium, and the next thing they get another helium atom and you get carbon. And it has to do it in vast quantities because there's a huge amount of carbon just on our Earth, but in the whole universe. So this very, very unlikely reaction to create carbon is happening in every single star. But the chances of it happening are almost minuscule, and science cannot explain it. God He's organizing every step of the way to create life. And then one of the biggest fine-tuned factors in our universe is the density of the universe. Dr. Weinberg, an atheist, calculated that if the energy density of the universe was off by only a factor of 10 to the 120th power, no life, no stars, no planets. Now that's hard to wrap your mind around. So I'm going to give you an example to kind of get you an idea of how small a chance that is. If you were to take dimes and cover the entire continental United States with a layer of dimes, then cover South America with a layer of dimes, then cover Africa and Europe with a layer of dimes, and then keep piling the dimes up until they reached the moon. If you took one dime out, no life. Makes it a little more real, doesn't it? So if there's one single dime missing, nothing. Okay, let's go. That's the universe. That's how the universe was fine-tuned, how everything was set up by God so that we would have life. But then there's the earth. Now the earth is in an arm of the Milky Way called the Orion Arm. It's located about 3/4 of the way out from the center of the Milky Way, which is the Milky Way galaxy. If we were even slightly closer to the center of the Milky Way galaxy, there's so much radiation, there would be no life. If we were only slightly further out on that Orion arm, the spacing of the planets would open up so far that we'd be too far from the sun to have any life. We're at that perfect spot. Not only are we at the perfect spot for life, we are in the perfect spot to observe God's handiwork in the universe. We're in the perfect spot where there's no gas cloud around us. There's nothing blocking our vision to be able to see the other galaxies, to see the Milky Way, to see where we're at, to see all of the wonders that God's created in this universe. It's like God put us here so that we could see the magnificent work that He put into making us exist. Now, the size of the earth. The size of the earth is absolutely the perfect size for life. The size of the earth determines the amount of gravity we have. And again, if it was any bigger, too much gravity, atmosphere would be too thick. If it was any smaller, atmosphere would escape and go off. Now, the reality is the earth was not always this size. About 4.5 billion years ago, there was a planet orbiting our sun at exactly this spot. And scientists call that planet Theia. It's just a name to give it. And Theia was struck by another planet. It's something that almost never happens in the universe. I mean, asteroids, yeah, but not another planet. It's like someone lined up the absolute perfect pool shot, so that that cue ball came down, that other planet came down and hit Earth at exactly the right angle, exactly the right speed, with exactly the right spin on it, so that we didn't leave our orbit. We stayed right where we were. Even more, the two planets, instead of bouncing off each other, combined. And a bunch of matter was spewed back out into space, just the perfect amount to create our moon and to leave our Earth at the perfect right size. And that other planet that hit us had the absolute perfect elements in it so that we would have all the necessary things on Earth to create life. I don't know about you, but I don't think that pool shot can happen by pure chance. I don't think that planet hitting Earth was pure chance. Now, the moon, that matter that was ejected in the collision, the moon is the biggest moon in our whole solar system. And the moon is at the perfect distance from Earth so that it can create tides, which are another thing that helps promote life. It's also the perfect size and at the perfect distance to stabilize our axis so that we don't wobble and our seasons are very stable. If it wasn't for the moon, all the other planets do this, they wobble dramatically. And it had to have some sort of intelligence that set that up. And also, the moon is 1/27th the size of the earth. The distance from the earth to the sun is 93,000 miles. The distance from the earth to the moon is 240,000 miles. Therefore, the distance from the earth to the sun is 400 times the distance from the earth to the moon. Now, the moon is 1/400th the size of the sun. But because of that matching of the distance, when we look at the moon, it's exactly the same size as the sun. That's why we can have perfect solar eclipses, where the moon can completely block the sun. And we can see the corona and the solar flares. And if it wasn't for that, there are so many scientific findings that they would not know about. There are elements that they found that they would not have known about. They would not have known that Einstein's theory that light is bent by gravity is actually true if it wasn't for that. It's like God set it up so that we could find things out about his wonderful creation. The other thing that happened when that planet hit our planet was the first planet had a very, very thick, dense atmosphere that didn't even let light come in. And when it hit, it blew that atmosphere away and thinned the atmosphere down and let light come in. Now, the other thing that's really unique about Earth is our placement in the solar system. We are the third rock from the sun. Now, if we were just 1% different in our orbit, again, no life. Now, the fourth rock is Mars. Then there's an asteroid belt. Then giant Jupiter, then Saturn. Both have huge gravities. But Saturn and Jupiter act like linebackers in a football game. They suck in all the asteroids that would normally be hitting Earth so that we're protected. Now, there are occasionally asteroids like the one that came down and killed the dinosaurs, which actually was beneficial to life. But if it wasn't for Jupiter and Saturn, we would be constantly bombarded with life-killing asteroids. So not only are we at the right distance from the sun, we've got neighbors that are doing us a monstrous favor. These giant planets, they're constantly being bombarded with asteroids that we don't even know about, that we don't even see. There's also a host of preconditions that I don't want to talk about, but I want to talk about something that everybody's very familiar with, and it's the miracle. Now, I'm going to say miracle. The miracle of water. Now, when I get done telling you about this, you're never going to look at a glass of water again the same way. Now, I'm going to ask you a question. Why does ice float in water? Ice is water. Why does ice float in water? He said less dense. Okay. Ice is actually 9% less dense than liquid water. Less dense means floats to the top. Do you know science has no idea why? It just does that. Water is also something that is unheard of. It is a universal solvent. Water will dissolve anything to a certain extent. It will even dissolve gold to a certain extent. Water is a universal solvent. Now, also, water is non-compressible. There aren't very many fluids that are non-compressible. That allows our heart to pump blood to the very tips of our fingers. If it was compressible, it wouldn't get anywhere. Now, water freezes at what temperature? 32. What temperature does it boil at? 212, right? Now, I'm a former chemist, but in chemistry, we can take a look at the atoms that form a molecule, and we can predict the boiling point and the temperature of that molecule by the atoms that form it. If we look at the atoms that form water and do the calculation for the boiling point and the freezing point, water should boil at 32 degrees and freeze at minus 146. Now, why does water boil at 212 and freeze at 32? Science has no idea. But it has to do that because as water vapor rises in our atmosphere, it gets colder. It gets up so high, it freezes, falls back to earth. If it didn't, all the water would be gone. And it boils at such a high point that we aren't bathing in humidity all the time. I mean, there are some days in the summer where we think we are, but it still isn't 212 degrees out. So the low freezing point keeps keeps water on the earth and also keeps us from having just a humid condition. Now, one of the things that I worked with a scientist who thought that water was metastable. Now, if that pencil laying on my hand, that's stable. It's laying on its side. Now, if I can balance this on the tip of my finger, let's see if I can do that. There we go. That's metastable. Now, I'm kind of cheating a little bit. I got a little thing. I couldn't do that normally. But metastability, and what he thought was that water should be a solid. It should be a crystal. So I worked with him, and I made glassware, and we worked at very low vacuums with ultra pure water. Tried to seed it with all sorts of crystals to form that crystal. Now here's the scary thing: if water really truly was metastable, and it was like that, and you formed that crystal, water would become stable, and every bit of water on Earth would instantly become solid, and life would end. And this crazy guy was actually trying to do that, trying to form that crystal. Now, luckily, he never did. It never happened, and we're still here, and we don't have to worry about the stability of water. Now, the other properties of water get even stranger. But to give you those properties, I have to first look at the sun. Now, the sun is this huge ball of hydrogen that's fusing together to form helium, and it gives off a spectrum of radiation. Now, if you were to look at the wavelength of the radiation that the sun gives off, and you looked at every wavelength, and you represented that wavelength by one of these playing cards, okay? One wavelength. To represent the complete wavelength coming off the sun, you would need a deck of cards stacked from here to the closest star to Earth. Hard to wrap your mind around it. But the only point of that spectrum of radiation the sun gives off is the part that helps us produce life, the visible spectrum that we see. That's like taking, out of that huge stack of playing cards, taking 2 cards. And the crazy thing is, our sun takes 70% of its energy to produce those 2 wavelengths that we see as visible light that produce life. Now, the other 30% is very detrimental to life, but along comes water. Water, as you can see in the picture, lets visible light go right through it. But water absorbs 100% of those deadly rays that would kill life. Water lets visible, life-producing light penetrate and absorbs all of the stuff that would kill life. If it wasn't for water, there would be no life on Earth. The other thing is that ice floats, it's also an insulator. Our lakes, if it wasn't for ice floating, would freeze from the bottom up and all life would be killed. Now it freezes on top and life is preserved underneath. So, and they don't have any reason for why water does that. Water is a true miracle. It's not what it's supposed to be. So every time you pick up that glass of water from this point on, that's God's miracle that helped us to be here and helps us continue to be here. God's miracle of water. Now, water also has an extremely high surface tension that's only exceeded by mercury. Because of the surface tension, that's why water can go all the way to the top of those trees and feed those leaves on that beautiful tree in your front yard. Surface tension is what causes a capillary action, they call it. It goes up those tiny little... And when it gets out to the leaves, the sunlight hits the leaves, and there's chlorophyll in the leaves. And the chlorophyll catalyzes the sun's energy to break water back down into hydrogen and oxygen. The oxygen is given off. The tree absorbs carbon dioxide from the air, combines that with the hydrogen, and forms sugars and starches that are the thing that feed us. Our grain, our fruits, our vegetables, all go through that same photosynthesis. Take water, react it into hydrogen and oxygen, react the CO2, form sugars, proteins, and starches. And again, the action of chlorophyll, science has tried to duplicate that so many times. They'd love to be able to break water down to hydrogen and oxygen to create fuel with just a catalyst. Have not been able to do that. They can do it with high energy, with electricity, but they can't do it with just a catalyst. Now, elements come from molecules and cells and matter. And then we said, all forces necessary to create this matter in life have been fine-tuned to make it happen. But atoms are not the smallest thing about everything that everything is made of. Science has been able to break down atoms, or the pieces of atoms, the protons, neutrons, and electrons, into other pieces, small particles. They're called fermions. Now, you don't have to remember this, but I'm going to tell you. Fermions, quarks, there are 3 types of quarks. There are leptons, there are 4 types of those. There are bosons, of which there are 5 types of those. And then a whole bunch of hypothetical particles. Now, the strangest fact about these pieces of atoms that they've broken down is they have no mass. They are only energy. These particles are pieces of energy. There's no mass, no weight at all. Now, there was a guy by the name of Higgs that postulated that there's going to be a particle that's going to react with a field in the universe that is everywhere, called the Higgs field, that will give atoms mass. And the Large Hadron Collider that's in France, actually it's between Switzerland and France, finally did discover the Higgs boson, the particle. They called it the God particle because it's giving us mass. It's giving us a weight. So you can blame your weight when you get on the scale to the Higgs boson. But again, the Higgs boson, that particle, is only energy. And it only appears to have mass when it goes through this field, this thing that penetrates the whole, that is everywhere in the universe. In Acts 17:28, it says, "For in him we live and move and exist." That field actually makes us exist. And then in John 1:3, it says, "All things came into being through him, and apart from him, nothing came into being that has not come into being." God is handiwork is here all the time. It's just that science doesn't want to acknowledge it. They want to say that it's a field that they have not, actually, they found the Higgs boson, but they have not been able to discover the field. Now, now we enter into an area, when you get down to these real small particles, we enter into an area that in physics that's really strange. It's called quantum physics. This form of physics comes in when we start looking at the extremely small, tiny electrons, protons, the subatomic particles. The old Newtonian physics that predicts for every action there's an opposite and equal reaction and that type of thing doesn't work down in these small particles. For one of the things in quantum physics, we can't know the spin and the location of an electron at the same time. That's kind of like saying, I don't know where my child is, but I know he's going to the potty. You know, if he's going to the potty, you kind of know where he is, don't you? But with an electron, you can't know both at the same time. These particles seem to exist in 2 different worlds all at the same time. There's one more way of showing this strangeness that's there down at these small particles. If they took 2 electrons from the same atom and sent them in on beams in two different directions. And they traveled till they were at the opposite ends of the universe. And then they changed the direction of one electron. The other electron would instantly go in the same direction. Instantly. Now, if information in our universe is only transmitted at the speed of light, which is, they say, is the speed limit, this couldn't happen. This is instantaneously. So information is being transmitted across the universe at something even at an instantaneous speed. It's a miracle. Now, comes to that question, are miracles possible or are they only delusions? What do you think? I bet everyone here could actually tell a story about a miracle that happened to someone or someone they knew, or there's always been some sort of miracle. God works his miracles through the reality of our world. And I think one of the reasons he does that is he could make it happen just by his pure willpower, but he does it through the reality of our world, our natural world. He does it so that we still have free will. There are still people that could say, that was just, the doctors did something for that person, or this something happened over there. He allows us to continually keep our free will. He's not, how can I put it? He's not staring us in the face and said, you better believe. He's saying, you make a choice. Now, quantum mechanics, that whole idea, has changed the understanding of nature. And in quantum mechanics, not only are miracles theoretically possible, but according to quantum mechanics, they are observed regularly. They happen all the time. And you know what they call them? I love the name. They don't call them miracles. They call them insufficiently caused events. These things happen in the laboratory that they have no explanation for. These miracles that are happening with subatomic particles appearing and disappearing and vaporizing and coming and appearing in the craziest places, and it's totally a miracle, and they call them insufficiently caused events, not miracles. I know of a friend of mine who had a very bad tumor on his leg. And when he went to the doctor's office, they did an exam, and they found tumors all through his body. They immediately rushed him down to Philadelphia, and he was going to go through surgery. And the day of the surgery, they did a scan to find out where the tumors were. And everybody was rushing around and going crazy because his tumors were gone. Now, I can't say this guy was a real godly man, but God performed a miracle on him. And it totally changed his life, went in a total different direction. And as I said, I'm sure everyone here can talk about those kind of miracles. But people will deny that, and they'll find some excuse. They'll say that, oh, he was going through chemo and it just started to affect him. No, he wasn't. They hadn't done anything. And those tumors were gone. One of the miracles that we don't even think about is, in 1948, the Jews returned to Israel. That was predicted in the Bible, that would happen. And so many countries didn't want that to happen, but it happened. I'm sure that you could talk about miracles that happen all the time. I just learned about this new finding in the Bible, in Genesis. It says that everything was created in 6 days. But according to science, the universe is about 15 billion years old. Well, Einstein says that time is affected by both gravity and speed. At the speed of light, time stops. At a very high gravity, time slows down. And they've proven that by taking a look at our sun, which has a huge gravity, and they look at the peaks of the wavelength of light being transmitted from the sun. And for every million seconds, the light coming from the sun is 0.21 seconds slower than the light traveling here on Earth. So time is affected by gravity. So time is relative to the position you are in the universe. So scientists started looking at the rest of the universe to see what they could find out about what time is, and how they do that is by looking at the wavelength, or actually the temperature of the radiation that they see. Now they found the echo of the Big Bang, and it's out there, and its temperature is 3 degrees Kelvin, which is a different measuring temperature, but it's pretty cold. And they looked at the wavelength of that light, and what they found that wavelength is 1 millionth slower than the time on Earth. So if you do the math, the time for the universe, instead of being 15 billion years, is 6.2 days. Now, they didn't want to agree with the Bible, but the math came out perfect. We're living in the 7th day, and the time for the universe is 6.2 days. There are miracles happening all around us. Again, as I said, the miracle of water, miracles that people have. We're coming to the time I want to start answering any questions that you have. This fine-tuning of the universe, God's hand is shown in it every time. The possibility of all of these things being preset the way they were is so small. The mathematics say that it is not possible to be a random occurrence. It had to be preset by an intelligence. And the wonderful thing is a benevolent intelligence that wanted us to exist. Fine-tuning is helping us to understand how powerful God is. I mean, you can't imagine the power that it would take to do what he did to make us exist. So now, if there's anyone who has any questions, it doesn't have to have anything to do with this either. If you have something from, go ahead, Ron.
You mentioned a few times 14 billion years ago. Do you personally believe that is true? I mean, I agree with everything you said, and I thank you because I learned many things today. But I kind of stick to what the Bible says. The Bible says.
Well, the Bible's correct. If you look at the time of on the basis of the universal time, it's 6.2 days.
Okay, so you do agree that it's 6-day creation?
Absolutely. It's a 6-day creation.
24 hours.
6 24-hour days for the universe. But for us, okay, we're living in the time frame that's here on earth. And if you look at Genesis, who's speaking? It's from whose perspective is Genesis being written in? It's from God's perspective. And therefore, God's perspective is the universal perspective.
The other proof that I really believe is the genealogy in the Bible. If you add all the geology, this guy begot the other guy, you add, I think approximately comes to 6,000-7,000.
It actually comes to a longer period than that.
A little longer, yeah. But, this longer billion of the Earth is 14.5 million years old. The Big Bang happened 14-something billion years ago. All this is not real. I mean, this is evolution needs millions of years to explain.
Tens of millions of years for things to evolve.
So, I believe that God has the power of creating everything in 6 days to grace.
And he did in 6.2 days.
Correct.
Yeah. It's all perspective. It's where you're looking from, okay? And as far as the genealogy, last time I talked about the idea that scientists were looking at turtles on an island. And they thought, well, maybe all these turtles have some common ancestry. So they took blood samples from the turtles, and they found out that there's a piece of their DNA that is only inherited from their mother. Okay? So when they looked, all the turtles on that island came from one female. Some female washed up on the island, laid her eggs, and started this turtle population on this island. Well, they thought, do humans have that same piece of DNA? And they found out they did. So they went and they took samples of blood from all the different races on Earth, expecting to find that each race was mothered by a single mother. What they found was that all human beings on Earth had one common mother, Eve, which the Bible said already, which they didn't agree with. Now, and they looked at, right? And they said, we can look at the number of generations since Eve, okay? And the longest period they can find for that existence of that first Eve is 190,000 years. The first Homo sapien, 190,000 years ago. Now you talk about the genealogy in the Bible. If you look at the genealogy in the Bible and then you really add the dates and that, like for Methuselah, and agree that he really lived that number of years, and the 900 years here and the 900 years there. And one of the issues in the Bible in the genealogy is they don't list all of the generations. They list them as ancestors. And especially in Hebrew, it translates as ancestors. So they went and the closest approximation they can, if they add the Methuselah dates and all that other stuff, comes out to 190,000 years. So that science and the Bible are agreeing in that time frame. Now, they don't like the idea of there being one female, which the Bible said was Eve, that created all Homo sapiens. What they tried to say was, well, okay, but there were a lot of Homo sapiens, but the rest of them, none of them had any female offspring. Well, that's not going to happen. But we know Eve existed. If there was an Eve, there was an Adam. So science actually proved that genealogy and that time frame that you're talking about as far as for Homo sapiens. As far as the time frame for the earth to exist and life to come on earth, 6 days is the universal time. The billions of years are measured because of us. And I will say, the billion years or the 15 billion years is very roughly calculated. They really don't have a good way of saying this happened then, and we can follow through. But it is a long period of time, and for us. But for God, 6.2 days.
Can I say another thing regarding the dust on the moon accumulated? They calculated before going to the moon. They designed the thing that land on the moon with those long legs.
Mm-hmm.
You know why they did that?
Yeah, because they thought the dust was going to be all 4 feet deep.
Correct. According to their calculation of this million of years, should be so much dust there, but instead it's just a little bit. And that is in harmony with the idea that the earth and the moon were created not billion or million, but is much younger. But the scientists using the so-called evolutionary idea was
Well, one of the problems was when they sent the astronauts to the moon, the theory of how the moon came into existence was that it was a wandering asteroid that got into Earth's gravity and then was captured by Earth's gravity and came in and rotated around the Earth. When they went to the moon and took rocks and geological structures from the moon, they found that the moon was not a wandering asteroid, but actually was the product of that collision of those two planets. Okay? And in that collision, what was left was a lot of rubble initially. It took a long time for the moon to coalesce into that sphere that we see. And that theory of how much dust was up there was based on the idea that it was a wandering asteroid that came into existence, not that it was a collision. And that didn't come until after the landing and after they brought samples back. So that whole idea, it's been on the internet a lot, that whole idea that there should have been more dust and all that stuff. But they didn't know that until they landed on the moon and took rocks back to find out how the moon was created. And based on that conclusion, the amount of dust on the moon is fine. There's no problem with it at all. Any other questions? Yes, Mike.
There's there are certain scientific methods that we use to measure things. And especially when we're trying to look at the universe and things found on the earth kind of forensically, look back and say, well, this occurred then, or this occurred in this fashion, or whatever else. There's a presumption that we make, and I know this comes up a lot with carbon-14 dating and so forth. And the presumption is that all of the laws of physics that govern the universe right now are and exist exactly now or back then as they do now. That's part of the presumption. And that's why we can take looks back and so forth and so on. I was always curious as to whether or not that was speculation. Has that been pretty well documented? Could the laws of the universe, just speaking, I mean, God can do anything, but speaking just strictly in what's naturally observed, could they have been evolving sliding scales or whatever I'm trying to say, developing as time went on, so that certain processes sped up, certain things happened more rapidly 1,000 years ago than they do today and on back? Or whatever your thoughts on that.
In a shorter period of time as 1,000 years, no. Okay? In the billions of years, yes. At the instant of the Big Bang, and for a relatively short time afterwards, physics was out the window. Things were just not the way they are now. But it coalesced fairly quickly. Within less than an hour after the Big Bang, 1 hour after the Big Bang, atoms were starting to form. There were starting to be hydrogen present in the universe, and things were starting to cool down. And so at that point, after that hour, standard physics pretty much took precedent. That model explains matter and the actions of matter. And as far as carbon-14 can only date things back about 250,000 years. After that, carbon-14 is worthless. To date a fossil bed that's 530 million years old, they usually use cesium, which has a much longer half-life. And again, there is inaccuracies in this. Was the carbon-14 content on Earth standard all the time in that 250,000 years? Was the cesium amount on Earth standard for the 530 million years? They assume it was to give them a date, but they don't know. They don't know. They can only use that as a basis to give an approximation. Now, the amount of error is probably about 20%. If it wasn't, it varied probably no more than 20%, because the Earth when it was formed was not in an area where there was a lot of radioactive material that was hitting the Earth to change that by a very large amount. But yeah, as far as physics goes, relatively shortly after the Big Bang, standard physics kicked in, and things have been the same ever since. I mean, does that answer your question? Yeah, there has been not been a variation. Yeah. Now, as far as time goes, okay, time is affected by speed and gravity. At the instant of the Big Bang, things were flying pretty fast. Okay. Also, the gravitational amount, because everything was squashed down in that little tiny thing, was humongous. So time was really messed up right in the beginning. And time, it took a few billion years for time to come into the point where we're seeing time as we know it. Time that's measured by scientific calculations is totally different than our time that we measure on a clock. Time by scientific calculations is measured by the peaks of a wavelength of light, of visible light, this distance between the peaks, and that's how they measure time. And that, as I said, varies depending on gravity. On the sun, it's a little bit closer here than it is here, so time is a little different on the sun. So time does vary, but the rest of physics really does pretty much standard throughout the universe. Any other questions? I hope I gave you enough ammunition to be able to talk to people about it. And you have another question?
Yeah, talking about the carbon-14, method of dating, I think is totally unreliable because I don't know if you guys read about carbon-14 dating all the trees that went down on after the explosion of Mount St. Helen that happened
Right.
in the 80s. Okay, they sampled those trees at the bottom of that lake, and they tried to date it using carbon-14. They did this test in several trees, okay? First of all, they gave a different date. And second, I think they were talking about 1,000 years ago, according to their calculation and with the carbon-14. We know up in the 80s, okay, carbon-14 never, after all these several tests done repeatedly, never gave a precise date.
Well, I wouldn't doubt it that something like a volcanic explosion, bringing carbon-14 from the Earth's crust could just change in that local area. And yeah, I wouldn't doubt that could happen, absolutely.
Not only that, but they discovered some frozen mammoth in Siberia. They dated one leg, gave one date, the date, another leg, 1,000 or even larger difference between two legs. They belong to the same animal with the carbon-14 dating system. So to me, it's also unreliable.
Yeah, carbon-14 has never been claimed to be very accurate. Like I said, it varies at least by 20%. And carbon-14 can be affected by the environment. If that bison was frozen in ice and the one leg stuck out, the carbon-14 on the one leg exposed to the sun would be different than...
Which one you believe, this leg or the other?
Well, exactly. I mean, you don't know because it can vary. But it's only used as an approximation to give you an idea.
It's used by the scientific community as a gospel.
But only for a short period of time. They can't go back more than 250,000 years. They can't go back billions of years with carbon-14. It doesn't work. Carbon-14 is gone after so many years, after 250,000 years. There's none there to date anything. They can't date anything older than that. So it's not used to date really old things, or layers of fossils in rocks. How do they date when that layer of fossils was laid down? They usually use cesium, which is much more, has a much slower half-life, is not affected by environment, and also has been consistent. It was part of the makeup of the Earth when it first came into existence. It's a radioactive isotope, so it does have a half-life. It decays over but a very slow period of time. Anybody else? Again, when you look at that glass of water from this point on, remember, water is a miracle. Water, God made water just the way it is so that we could exist. It's not supposed to be the way it is, but God made water our miracle. So you've got every time you pick up that glass of water, you've got a miracle in your hand. Thank you for listening to me. I hope I helped. And good night.